This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 349, Storage Entities. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about storage entities with Martin Anderson-clutz. Martin is a senior solutions engineer at Acquia that's been using Drupal for over 16 years. He helps maintain a growing list of contrib modules. He has spoken about those modules on this show in the past, and he also does it at camps and conferences. He's been a guest host on Talking Drupal from episode 336 to 339. Martin lives in London, Ontario, Canada. He's with his wife, son, cat, and dog. Martin, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
I'm Stephen Cross, and today my co-hosts are Nick Laughlin.
Good morning. Really excited about the show today.
And Mike Herschel is coming back for the second co-host week. Welcome, Mike.
Welcome. As a front-end developer, I'm interested to learn what a storage entity is.
All right, great. You might represent a number of our listeners, so that's a good point of view.
I'm going to ask you all the hard questions, Martin.
I'm ready.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of quick updates this week. One is I found a new tool this weekend. As I mentioned, I think last week or the week before, I've been working on a personal project that has a pretty big migration. And one of the issues that I ran into is one of the larger files that has like over 1 million rows doesn't have an ID, doesn't have an index. And believe it or not, I've actually never run a migration before where that didn't exist. So I haven't ever had to use a multi-column, CSV as an index. And I kind of assumed that Drupal migration supports, multiple columns as an index. But for whatever reason, in some short testing I did, I couldn't get it to work. So I started, rather than diving down that rabbit hole and figuring it out, I figured that there had to be an easy way to take a CSV and concatenate two columns to make an ID, because two of the columns were unique across, if you combine them, they were unique. And so when I ran the initial migration, I literally just opened the file, created a new column, concatenated two. But the problem is, like I said, it has 1,200,000 rows. It's 19 megabytes that, you would create the column, do the concatenation, copy it, and it would take, it would lock up for 1.5 minutes. Then it would copy, you could save it, move on. It was great. But I thought about it like, I need to be able to repeat this because this is a changing data set that I download whenever I need to run it. And I didn't want to have to, open it. There's also human error there with concatenating if I type it wrong, all that kind of stuff. So I started looking around. I'm like, so I started using, League CSV because there's tools in Drupal to do that. But again, I was like, this is way more complex than it should be. There has to be a tool that will allow me to do this on the command line in a repeatable way. And I found this project called Miller. And I was completely and utterly blown away by this project. It is one of the, it's just a simple indexable data processor, essentially. So you can use it with CSVs, with JSON, that kind of stuff. But basically, you pass it in a file. I told it, take these two columns, combine them together, almost like a PHP syntax, like, with, dot to combine them, and then name it this and output it to a new file. It took me about 5 minutes to install and get the syntax right and run it. But the thing that really impressed me is that 1.2 million row CSV takes it less than 1 second to process and generate the new column. You run it and it just immediately generates it super, super fast. One of the things that I realized with this tool is, and this is kind of what it's really for, the claim to fame is it's for data processing. So if you have a CSV or JSON data set or something like that, and you need to manipulate the data to output something better, this is a great way to pre-process that. You can, like I said, you can create a new index, you can delete fields that you don't need, things like that. And it's just it is one of the fastest things that I've run like that. It is mind-boggling how fast it is. So if you have a large data set that you need to kind of munge and build a report on, This is a great way to kind of make that programmatic. I was very impressed. The other thing, just kind of mention in passing, I added a new feature to the Talking Drupal website this weekend as well. So if you want to, if we mention one of your modules on Module of the Week and you wanted to kind of link to that on the module page, there are now anchor tags with the episode ID there. So you can link to it and, call that out if you want to.
That's great. Thanks for getting that done. And speaking of the module of the week, Martin's going to tell us about Preview Link.
Right. So not a super common use case, but definitely something I've heard of a few sites needing is the ability kind of during the sort of workflow approval process to be able to get somebody to view a piece of content, basically to offer feedback before it's actually published. And in a traditional Drupal workflow, there isn't really a way to do that. So what Preview Link does is it creates a link with a token on it that will allow an outside party to bypass the standard permission system that's built into workflows, so that an outside party can basically access an unpublished piece of content for a period of time. You can basically choose how long the link should be usable before it expires, and so it allows you to open up that unpublished content for review and feedback, but also have some control over how long anybody with that link will be able to have that access.
Does it also work with other content on the page? For example, if there's a view that requires, it to be published to show up, will it also bypass the access for something like that as well?
That is an excellent question, and hopefully one of the listeners can try it out and let us know.
Yeah, I'll have to test that out, because one of the issues that I run into with unpublished content like that is, for example, when you have a hero on a page and you take the hero out and load it in a view, if the page is unpublished, then that view won't show up. And you don't want to just make the view available to unpublished people, because then people that before the page is published, there'll be just this random page with a view on it, obviously.
Yeah. The other way you can do it is in your view, there's like a published or admin. I don't know if the Preview Link basically, treats it as an admin view. That might be able to work, but
yeah, that would be a perfect workaround if it uses that same bypass. So moving on to our main topic, I'm curious, Martin, what is the elevator pitch for storage entities?
So storage entities was really developed as a simple and reusable way to create non-node bundles, basically trying to give your site builders the same ease of creating ways of storing data that maybe isn't well suited to being nodes with the same sort of easy to use, flexible process they would use for building out content types.
Yeah, so I think on the module page you mentioned that it's kind of like the replacement for field collections, right?
I think that's one of the primary use cases is that ability to store kind of nested entities, or the other use case might be for data that doesn't necessarily line up well against being sort of like site content. So, as an example, if you had, user tasks that each user was managing for themselves, maybe that doesn't necessarily fit with the like conceptual idea of it really being sort of site content.
So I'm curious with obviously we'll talk a little bit more about this with paragraphs kind of in the Drupal world. What inspired you to create this module, and what problem were you trying to solve?
So it really came about a few years back. Some of my colleagues and I were starting to build more and more, migrations of Drupal 7 sites into, Drupal 8 and 9. And as you say, one of the common use cases that came up was what to do with sites that had been using things like field collections in Drupal 7. And certainly, paragraphs is one way that a lot of sites use to solve that kind of a problem. But as you know, paragraphs, as a very robust module, has a lot of capabilities around it. And so if you really just need the ability to sort of store that structured data on kind of maybe a multi-value level. So thinking about, let's say, an event content type where you have community contacts that aren't necessarily reusable from one event to another. You might want the ability to have, let's say, not just a like contact name and email, but the ability to have multiple of those. And there isn't sort of a very easy way to do that with some of the standard Drupal fields. That's where field collections was a great solution in Drupal 7, and so we had started to explore some different options. And I know there was one project where I had used ECK, so Entity Construction Kit, which is very powerful. But at the time I had used it, it was kind of still in alpha, and so there were some kind of rough edges in terms of trying to use that. I think the next project where I needed this kind of a custom entity type, I ended up building one from scratch, and while that worked quite well, it was a fair bit of work to set up, and so started trying to think about what's a reusable way to basically do that work of building a custom entity. So the idea was really make a single reusable custom entity type. In this case, we call it storage. And then when site builders need that ability, they can basically just add a new bundle onto that storage entity type.
So can I repeat this back to you to make sure I understand properly? So the main difference between this and something like paragraphs is that when I create a paragraph, those those paragraph items are reusable. But when I create this with field storage, it's kind of a one-time thing. Am I understanding that properly?
No, I would say in both cases they're really reusable, but to some degree, it's I think in both cases it comes down to sort of how you design those. I mean, because storage entities really is intended to be used with inline entity form. Part of that is around how you configure that in terms of whether, let's say, a content author can choose an existing storage entity or always has to create a new one, as an example.
Got it. That makes a little bit of that makes a little sense. But the storage entities the content author creates, they could potentially be reusable, correct?
They could be reusable for sure.
Now, does this run into any of the I know Paragraphs has had some issues with like database bloat with the revisions, where the revisions can kind of compound as you work your way up. Does storage entity run into any similar issues, or does it have any mitigations, or is architecture different enough where it doesn't apply?
So you do have the option on kind of a per bundle level as to whether or not you want it to always generate new revisions to the storage entity. There is an open feature request to have the ability to basically automatically remove orphaned storage entities. So that's definitely something on the roadmap.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are probably the two primary ways that it tries to mitigate that kind of database bloat.
All right. So Martin, what is the benefit of creating a new entity type and not just using Node?
So there's really a couple of issues. I would say first and foremost, nodes are really intended to be accessed directly. And so, I've certainly worked on sites where kind of as a workaround, a site might use something like Rabbit Hole to basically redirect, somebody who might be trying to access some kind of a piece of content that's really intended to be consumed as part of a parent entity, to sort of redirect that to the parent. Mm-hmm. So really, to me, in a way that's almost like not using the right tool for the job, if you understand what I mean. So really trying to use instead an entity that's designed to be consumed in that kind of a nested way. The other thing too is then even if you use Rabbit Hole, then you've still got that content type showing up in sort of your add content menu, in your content dashboard, some of those other kinds of things. Right. Again, where it's really not meant to be there at all. And so by using a separate entity type, it really gives you a lot more flexibility. And again, it's partly the spirit of just sort of using the tool that's designed for that kind of use case.
Yeah, I just want to chime in here because like I said, I used storage this weekend. I think that might have been on the pre-show for the patrons. But this weekend, I converted that site that I've been talking about the migration stuff from Paragraphs to storage entity to kind of test it out. And just at a high level, maybe for our listeners, it's helpful. Maybe it'll be helpful as a user if I just say what I noticed the major differences are. One, which is very, very nice, is it provides a way to view all the storage entities. Like it gives you a new content page and you can see all the entities. And of course you can build something like that for paragraphs, but out of the box, paragraphs, really are implied and meant to be internal to a piece of content. You can reference paragraphs elsewhere. You can reuse them. They are entities. But for example, there's no default way to view all the paragraphs on your site without creating some sort of custom view for that.
I just want to make a point that paragraphs was not really intended to store data like this, right?
Yeah.
It was really intended to provide inline content editing tools.
Yeah.
That's not what this is. They're kind of like, it's a little bit comparing apples to oranges a little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that there was no alternative to using paragraphs in that way until storage entities really exists now, right?
Or creating your own custom entity.
Right.
And so the other, as a user, the other really big improvement that I noticed is, as you said, Martin, revisions are kind of an option on a per bundle basis. So in a lot of cases, you don't need to revision them if they're treated as their own entity sometimes. And with paragraphs, you don't really have that choice. Paragraphs requires entity revisions, entity reference revisions, even in cases where it doesn't work. Like there's a known bug with revisions and translations with paragraphs. If you have translated content, then you're not going to get the correct revision of that paragraph if it's translated. You just won't. And so in a lot of, in those cases, it's probably better just to not revise, not create a revision for that, because you're not going to be able to access that anyway, right? And so with those two things, those might seem like minor changes, but from a data architecture standpoint, they're pretty massive, because you can kind of keep your database cleaner. The other really big thing that I noticed, and this may not be intentional, Martin, on your part when you created this, because of the way paragraphs is built, it kind of is, like I said, it assumes that it's associated with a piece of content. So if you're using it to create just like data entities that you can process elsewhere or join together in a custom, entity query or something, you have to be very careful, because there's a lot of paragraph cleanup things that sometimes you'll try to run. And if you run those cleanup processes with paragraphs that are strictly data storage, they would get deleted. Whereas storage entity is very much like, it's just an entity. So if you create a standalone entity to store data, it's not going to get deleted, right? It's kind of a separate, it's a separate entity. But again, it doesn't have all the overhead that a node has. It doesn't necessarily have to have a URL. It doesn't have to have a path. It doesn't have to have all that stuff. It's kind of like a taxonomy, and it's very, very fast. So very happy with it.
One other thing I'll just also follow up on there, Nick. You mentioned about how it has its own interface to be able to basically view the list of whatever kind of storage entity you're looking at. There is also a module called Content Auto Grid, where if you wanted to see not just sort of like the title and then links to manage content, but actually like all of the columns, almost like a database view, it can generate those for you as well, if that's helpful.
Oh, really? I've never heard of that module, so I'll look into that too.
Yeah, I'm looking into that.
Nick, you just mentioned that it's very, very fast, but I don't see, can you clarify this for me, Martin? I don't see anything in the way this is structured that you get performance improvements generally, because the data model is still the same data model as a node, really, isn't it?
I would say it's pretty similar, but I think a lot of the sort of, very rich features that a lot of sites build around nodes, so things like, path auto, scheduled publishing, content moderation, all of those are things that tend to be built around nodes. And so by using a separate entity type that's really not likely to have as many different kinds of, hooks and other kinds of things attached to it.
That, yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
From a PHP side, with the number of hooks and things happening, there's less of that going on. Okay, that I follow. All right.
Yeah, and the option to just turn off revisions, like I said, like in my case, when I'm migrating millions of rows,
right. Yeah.
revisions is just an extra process for every single one.
But you can turn that off on a node. You don't have to have that on a node.
But not paragraphs. And traditionally, I've always used
Gotcha.
paragraphs for this type of content.
All right.
So how is this different than creating a custom entity?
So I would say in terms of how you use it, it's meant to be basically identical to working with a custom entity, because I built it as a module exactly the way I had previously built a custom entity for using with a website. The difference being that it's essentially something you can install and start using right away, instead of writing all of those different classes and list handlers and all of those pieces that at least today are still fairly I would say developer intensive in terms of the skills required to start using them. Whereas this is something that even somebody fairly new to Drupal could just install the module and then start creating their different bundles.
Yeah, I have to say I've created custom entities in the past, and I think you kind of glossed over a bit when we talked about it earlier, but there's a lot of boilerplate to create a custom entity. And by a lot of boilerplate, there is a ton of boilerplate. And things like Drupal console make that a little bit easier, but it's something like, I don't remember exactly, but it's like 10 or 15 files, right? Which is why many times on projects, if I needed just kind of a data storage mechanism type thing, I would use something like paragraphs, because it's very easy to create it in the user interface. You can make changes simply, like if you need to add a field, remove a field, like you just can do it in the UI and export the config. And as you kind of have been mentioning, like I didn't use nodes for that, because many times you don't need a path, or you don't need all the all this other stuff. You don't want to use taxonomy because you don't need hierarchy or anything like that. You just kind of need a standalone entity, and paragraphs is a very, very simple way to prototype that. Now, if you need significant performance or something, then yeah, you'd create a custom entity, but there's a lot of overhead to doing that. And storage kind of takes care of that. You'll get the same performance benefits of having a custom entity with storage without all that other node or taxonomy overhead that comes along with it, but you can still create it in the UI. So I guess one of the questions that we kind of asked this a little bit before, but again, what drove you to make this lightweight? Why was there a specific feature that you were building that made you realize that you needed to make this a generic module versus just creating a custom entity yourself? Like what was the project driving this, or was it just something that you'd seen over and over and just decided to make the module?
Yeah, as you say, I think we touched on it a little bit, but it was really around really trying to have it as a tool that would be kind of another reason to have it as something that you would use other than sort of node or taxonomy, in terms of really being kind of as stripped down and lightweight as possible, so that it's really just meant to be flexible and something that can allow site builders to build those out quickly without having to sort of fight with maybe undoing some of the assumptions that like a node or a taxonomy would be making around how it's intended to be used.
So Martin, a couple of questions here. One is, I don't think we've talked about how long this module has been available, and then what are the current roadmap? What does the roadmap look like for upcoming features?
Sure. So actually, as it turns out, over the weekend, it was the 1-year anniversary of the first stable release for storage entities, and also maybe while we're talking about that, I want to throw a shout out to MXH, Max from Germany, who's been an excellent co-maintainer for me on the module. One of the primary things as on the roadmap for storage entities is that ability to be able to automatically delete orphan data. So as an example, if the parent entity is deleted or just updated, to remove the reference to that nested sort of storage entity, to have that be able to be automatically removed. But even in terms of some of the features that are built into it today, we already talked about the ability to turn on or off the creation of revisions, but also a couple of features that might be interesting for people are things similar to Rabbit Hole, sort of a light version of the ability to restrict direct access to a storage entity, as well as the ability to be able to use patterns to control how a storage entity will be displayed. And so, again, sort of light versions of what you would get with like a rabbit hole or auto entity label are things you can sort of use out of the box with storage entities.
So I do have a feature request, and I don't know if this is nonsensical or impossible, but I did, as I said, I kind of moved this into a project this weekend. So one thing that I noticed is you have the name field, which is, or title field. It's similar to like the name field in taxonomy. And you do have the ability to kind of autofill it with a token. But I wonder if it'd be possible, and by the way, this is one of those departures from Paragraph, because Paragraph doesn't have a concept of label, which in many cases can cause problems. But in my use case, I actually have the reverse. I don't know if there's a way to make that optional, period. Because like I said, in my use case, for example, a lot of the things are just like two fields used to store some data. There really isn't a title. So I'm just finding a way I'm either putting some just default random stuff, and that's just taking up space. And obviously I can make it one character, but if I can just get rid of it, it would make it cleaner. But then again, I imagine making the label field on an entity optional is probably a pretty major undertaking. So
you could probably throw some random stuff in there, like a date stamp or something, right?
Theoretically, the other way to handle that would be to store an empty value and then use whatever pattern you set at the bundle level just when it gets displayed, so that if you were looking at that list, it could generate whatever pattern, but not necessarily store that, since it really isn't information that's different from what's already being stored.
Yeah, exactly. And Mike, that's kind of the reason behind the request is, like, for example, one of the storage entities I have really is just two fields that are entity references to two separate entities. So it's kind of like a pivot table to join things together. And I can't just, you would normally just put those directly on the entity, but some of these entities have thousands of relationships. And so if you try to do that, things will go poorly. So this is a way to kind of tie things together and make a pivot table using storage entities. And so that I don't need a title, because I really just have two entity reference fields. But again, I just threw some default data in there, so not a big deal. But if you could have some that just don't have a name or label, that would be, that would save me another few hundred megabytes probably in my database.
Not to mention, as a content editor, the less amount of work the content editor has to do, the better. They shouldn't have to figure out, a title for something that's never going to get displayed. They're going to be putting people in there, training them. The person's going to be like, what do I enter here? And that's just friction that, is unnecessary.
Well, I will call out that Martin's actually already solved that issue, because like I said, you can put a pattern into the name field if you want to. And if you do that, you can actually hide it from the display form.
Ooh.
Yeah, so he's already got that improved. That feature request is already exists.
But you have to know that too,
What do you mean?
You have to know to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be clear, that's actually one of the interesting things about this project, Martin, is I've never seen that feature, but I like how you called it out in the intro. So when you're creating the bundle, it says, here's a name. You can enter a default here and use tokens. If you have something here, then you can hide it. That's still, I didn't use that feature, but that's the reason why I knew it was there.
So I will say auto entity label is a module that has basically that same functionality that you can use on, nodes and lots of other things. I've used it in sort of like staff directories, where you can basically, have the first and last name as the separate entry fields, and then create the title, combining multiple fields together. So that's, definitely one that I'm a big fan of for, the reasons we just talked about. But yeah, to have sort of a simplified version of that built in, I thought was a terrific win.
Yeah. Cool. So on the project page, it says the use case is a node of type article should have the information with a first name and last name of a person defined as 2 plain text fields. So instead of putting those directly on a node, you create a storage type that holds the 2 fields and then reference the storage entity from the node. So like, why is that a better solution than just doing it the old-fashioned way?
So if you were to attach those directly to, let's say, the parent entity in this case, your type article, you would have to either only have one value or kind of a fixed number of kind of first and last name pairs. Whereas this allows you to essentially create that as a storage entity bundle, and then you can have that as an unlimited, so that, you know, if an author only needs one, they can use one. If they need 7, they can do that. Potentially mix and match, you know, maybe some have only first and some only last, you know, or have, you know, custom validation around that. So it just makes it more flexible, really.
So in my book, that's kind of the textbook use case for paragraphs as well, though. So what differentiates that use case for you? Like, why in your mind would you use storage for that versus just use paragraphs that people are used to?
So I think it sort of goes back to what Stephen was talking about before, that paragraphs really wasn't intended for that use case. It's just because a lot of sites use paragraphs, you can use it for that as well. So I would say, you know, if you're using paragraphs on a site for layout, then maybe, you know, using it to address those same use cases for, you know, that sort of like nested data structure use case is maybe perfectly fine. But if you have a site where you're using Layout Builder, then to use paragraphs just for managing kind of those, you know, nested entities, you know, maybe is again, like not the right tool for the job, I guess.
So I guess I'm curious then, kind of stepping back then, what in your mind, what is the use case for paragraphs? Because my understanding was it was meant to be used for small data sets like that. Like in my mind, the using paragraphs for layout is the incorrect use case for paragraphs, whereas using it for this canonical, like small pieces of data is the correct way to do it. Did you have a different perspective on that? Like, what is paragraphs use case in your mind?
So, and I will confess here. So, you know, folks who love paragraphs, please don't send me hate mail. I haven't used paragraphs a ton. So in my mind, it's really around much more about around the presentation of data. So being able to have, let's say, you know, a section where it's like, you know, author bio that you could insert, you know, between like paragraphs of text and those kinds of things. Paragraphs, I guess, in both senses there. So really around being able to both structure and display content, whereas I feel like the ability to use it for just how you structure your content is, you know, again, to me, maybe not the way it was originally intended.
Interesting. Yeah, and don't worry, I don't think you're getting any hate mail from our listeners. It's just
I'm going to send you hate mail.
Well, just include some Florida Drupal camp stickers. I won't mind.
That's cool.
So one of the other things we've kind of mentioned in passing that's kind of a pretty big change to how, again, I don't want this to become a paragraphs versus storage show, but they do kind of overlap in a lot of ways. One of the other big changes is revisioning. So storage does have the ability to revision. You can also turn them off. Can you talk about, you know, what the strategy is with storage entities and revisions?
So part of the strategy around being able to allow storage bundles to turn on or off the revisions was really just around flexibility, so that it could be used for a variety of use cases. Theoretically, you could do things like, let's say you have a content type that is not revisioned, but then you could associate, basically have an entity reference field to a storage entity that is revisioned. So theoretically, you can sort of mix and match. I would say, you know, the obvious trade-off there is that you're adding, you know, complexity to your overall data model, but it, you know, again, it opens up some different options in terms of, you know, how you can sort of selectively revision content.
So just to make clear what that use case is if I have a node with 50 fields in it, and I want 4 of them or one of them to be revisioned. In the current world, I have to revision the entire node, all 50 fields. I could use storage entities to create that one field and have only that field revisioned, and then entity reference it back to the node. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I will confess that I haven't personally tested that. So,
Okay.
Again, if somebody wants to try that out and offer feedback if there are, potentially rough edges that need to be smoothed out, then by all means open up an issue and we'd be happy to look at that.
And I can't think of a practical use of it, but it is interesting to think about. It seems like inline entity form could be a critical piece or a critical module to use with storage entities. Can you talk about, what the status of inline entity form is in Drupal 9 and how well it's working?
So I've always found that it works really well in Drupal 8 and 9. It's I think it's officially in like release candidate 11. So, hopefully that gives you an indication that it's, pretty robust. And, for all my use cases, I found that it works really well. I like the ability to do things like have different form modes, so that, as an example, you might have, one form mode for creating something directly, but then have more of like an, embedded version of the form for that, so that it's really optimized or provides like a simplified way of creating something, within the context of, let's say, a parent entity form.
Whenever I see things like RC11, I always wonder like what module in Drupal has the highest number of release candidates. That
should be like a trivia question right there.
Yeah. I feel like it's probably web form if I had to guess, but
yeah.
Really? I think it's probably the Commerce guys, or Centauro team, like the modules that they manage, which inline entity form is one of them.
Yeah.
Is definitely, they're always very very careful about moving things from alpha to beta.
So Martin, I was just doing a little bit of Googling around. I found a module that's made by Lee Rowlands called Micro Content that looks like it does the same thing. It says Micro Content module provides a lightweight reusable content entity that you can use in your layout and entity reference fields. Have you looked at this module? Do you know it exists? And if so, is there overlap or what's the difference?
So I am aware of that module. I will confess that if I had have heard of it before starting on storage entities, I might not have built my own solution. I think at one point I did actually suggest to him in like a Slack thread that maybe we could figure out a way to like combine forces, because yes, there is significant overlap, I think, between those.
Yeah, but we're going to use yours though, because you're on our show. So all the users need to use yours. And another thing I noticed about yours is you already support Drupal 10. Uh-oh. I heard that. According to Drupal.org, you're supporting Drupal 10.
So let me reiterate here what an awesome co-maintainer I have, because that's not my doing. If it's true, it's because of the excellent work of MXH. So
yeah, cool. So there's a Drupal ideas issue. If y'all are familiar with the ideas queue, it's about like stuff that we can do in Drupal core. And the idea is basically fieldable fields. So that's what this is. And in my thought process, with all the works between like field collection, there was another one called multi-field. There's paragraphs, there's storage entities, and now there's micro content. All these things, these are solving a need that pretty much everybody needs. Do you think this should be in core? Do you think something as far as the architectural decisions that you made could go in core? What are your thoughts along those lines?
So I will confess that even when my colleagues and I were talking about the different ideas that eventually led to the creation of storage entities, there was a feeling that if it could have been implemented as a flexible way to create fields, that probably would have actually, in some ways, been a more elegant solution. The reason that we went with storage entities is just because it's so easy to create an entity, and then there's a robust UI around being able to create those new bundles, use the field UI to build out whatever sort of content structure. If there was a similar way within core to build out fields of fields as the ideas issue that you've linked to suggests, then that in many ways might be a better way, especially because when you think about that issue that we talked about in terms of being able to delete orphan content, I feel like is something that fields kind of do on their own. And so as long as that field of fields capability could do that same sort of orphan cleanup, then maybe that absolutely could be a better way to solve a similar set of problems.
Yeah, I'm looking at this issue right here. Your co-maintainer MXH has been active in this issue too. So,
really?
Yeah, he had actually started another module that did the same thing, and then again we got talking in Slack, and he seemed interested in helping to combine forces, and so has been putting a lot of excellent work into storage entities.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's cool.
So I kind of want to circle back to something that is kind of an ongoing known issue in the Drupal community, and that is naming modules. As you said, if you had known about the micro content, which isn't a bad name for what it is, then you might not have split off. Now, I think there's some strength in having multiple options. Obviously, there's some redundancy. If you look at paragraphs, for example, or like field collection, one of the issues with field collection was it was finished before the field API was finished in Drupal 7. And same thing with paragraphs. It was finished before the entity API was finished in Drupal 8. So you sometimes get a cleaner re-implementation at a later date. But one of the biggest issues with paragraphs, for example, is whenever I talk to clients, I always call them paragraphs because that's what it's called. But clients are always like, "What's a paragraph? Like, what does that mean?" Like it, and storage kind of has that same thing. But as somebody who creates one module a month, it seems like sometimes. What's your process on coming up with a name for modules? Is it something you just do you spend a lot of time thinking about it? Do you just, and how the heck was storage available at this point? I feel like that's one of those things that would have been taken years ago. But what's your process around that?
So, I mean, I feel like it's one of the truisms about programming that naming things is hard is like, one of the three fundamental challenges of development. It really, I think to some degree, it varies by the module. Sometimes, if it's like the, we were talking before the show for the Patreon supporters about a module called Content Moderation Link that I've been working on, and with that one, because of the nature of how it is doing what it is intended to do, it was pretty obvious what to call it. But a lot of times it's really difficult to decide, especially because one module can be used in different ways, and so do you sort of like pigeonhole it by naming something that's really tightly paired to one use case, and then people may not realize it can be used for another. But there have been lots of times where I've looked for a module to solve my problem, not been able to find one, developed a solution, and then released that as a module, only to find that there actually was an existing module that I just hadn't been able to find because I was thinking of specific words in the searches that I was trying to do, and it had been named just something slightly off from how I was looking for it. So I don't necessarily have like a simple answer, but I definitely feel like a lot of the work that's being done by the folks working on the project browser initiative, then hopefully the more we can make modules findable, then it'll help to reduce the propensity for people to create duplicate modules just because they couldn't find the existing solution.
I agree with that, and I'm a big fan when module maintainers cross post to other similar projects too. And I honestly think that should be like kind of a feature of like Drupal.org. Maybe after we finally migrate to D9. Because like naming things is always going to be hard. We're never going to solve that problem. But the findability, that's a different issue. It's related, but it's different.
Yeah. By the way, I do want to call out something that's kind of unique about micro content. It was created for Drupal 4.7 and then wasn't updated until Drupal 8. I wonder how many modules in use skipped 4 versions of Drupal.
I will say that I've had some modules recently where I wanted a particular namespace, and there had been like a Drupal 5 project that's hasn't been updated in years, and so I basically applied for and taken over that namespace, even though what I've actually done with that namespace basically has no relation to the original project.
Yeah, that's a problem common to most package management systems, right? And that's true of a lot of things. One of the, as you said, naming is difficult. One of the things that, and I've mentioned this podcast before, but I listened to Drive to Work, which is a Magic the Gathering head designer's podcast. And one of the things he talks about is names themselves are resources. Because if you don't know the game, every card has a name and it's canonical. If a card has a name, they can reprint it, but it is that card. You can't reuse a name. And he talks about getting a clean name after the game's been out 30 years, released 30,000 cards or something. He talks about sometimes looking back at one of those, a really clean name, and it does this really ridiculous thing that you can never use again. It's like I think Teleport is one of his examples. He's like, Teleport is a great name for something, and the card just like randomly does this thing that they will never do again. And the same is true for Drupal. As you said, naming is hard. I think web form is a great example of a great name because it does exactly what it sounds like, and it's very easy to find. But at this point, Drupal's been around for 20 years. There is going to be some of those names that are no longer used. And I guess the question is should there be a mechanism? I mean, there is a mechanism for recovery, but should there be a mechanism for recovery of namespaces like that? Because you could release a new one for a new version.
Yeah, I mean, basically the abandoned module workflow or process is really what you follow to take that over. And in a way, that's sort of what happened with web form, right? What we think of in Drupal 8 as web form started off as YAML form, but then when it was clear that there wasn't really traction around getting the D7 version of web form ported to D8, then they basically combined forces and made YAML form into the Drupal 8 version of web form.
Yeah, I can tell you a module name that is not good is paragraphs. Because as I don't know who mentioned it before, but like I've explained stuff to my content editors, and it's a little confusing. I really like the name micro content, to tell you the truth. But go ahead.
Well, we were talking earlier about like the module changing over time, and I suspect that the name made sense when it was created because they were structuring paragraphs, and it probably made perfect sense, but it has morphed. Something's very
and I 1,000%, if I was creating paragraphs, I would probably call it paragraphs too, and then people would be so like I want to be clear that this personally, this is not an indictment against that name. Like it
I mean,
like you said, it's naming is very difficult. I think I have 1 or 2 modules that I've created that I've published, and they're always helper modules on something, so it's easy for me. Like I think, for example, one of my modules is like something that does something with paragraphs, so it's paragraphs and then what it does. So it's very easy. Okay, so I think as we're coming to a close, I'm curious if somebody's interested in trying out storage entities. What do you think is a good way to get started, Martin?
So there is a module / initiative that I started a while ago called configuration kits. And basically it's sort of a pre-bundled set of configuration you can use to spin up. I mean, we've seen it with Smart Date when I was on the show a little while back talking about the Smart Date calendar kit and starter kit. But there are similar ones to be able to basically spin up functionality that'll allow you to test out using storage entities. So quick links will basically give you like a row of SVG icons that you can put on your homepage. And that's a really simple way to start using those. Similarly, there's a module called tasks that's really around, if users want to be able to, basically manage like a simple to-do list within the website, then it's a way to be able to use those. And I think probably these are also a couple of use cases that really demonstrate where it wouldn't really make sense necessarily to use kind of, nodes for storing this kind of data. So quick links probably, are almost never going to get changed. It doesn't really make sense to spin up an entire node just for one little icon.
Yeah.
And in the same way, tasks are probably really only like personally relevant. So you wouldn't necessarily think of those as being kind of, site content that way.
Yeah. And blocks have, traditionally when you create quick links, you can also use blocks or something like that. But again, that's a completely separate interface for editing it. It's just like taxonomy terms. If you're not editing them and maintaining them through the node interface, it's a whole nother section of the website that you have to train people on. But with storage, because you kind of have that content, it adds something to the content dropdown, and you have quick links. It's very easy to be like, hey, you just go here and you edit the quick link, and views just pulls in. I'll say, as somebody who, as this is probably the third or fourth time I mentioned this in the show, I used it this weekend. I converted from paragraphs to storage entity. It was, I would say, as long as you're familiar with entities, bundles, and what those mean, you'll have no trouble with this. You install it, it shows up in structure, you create your bundles, add your fields, it shows up in the content overview, and then you can reference it just with a normal entity reference field if you're using it as an entity reference. And I had no trouble. And then on the side of migration, because like I said, this was a migration project, the entity type is storage. And so as far as migrating it, I literally just copied the paragraph migrations, converted it from, I think the type is entity reference revision : paragraphs for a paragraph. I just changed it to entity : storage. And since I use the same naming structure for my fields, everything just worked out of the box. So yeah, it was really straightforward.
That's awesome. I mean, if you do run into any rough patches, by all means, open up issues on the project, and happy to do anything we can to make it support migrations even better if that's possible.
Great, Martin. Thanks for joining us today. Is there anything that you want to mention that we can cover?
I think that's good for today.
For our listeners, do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel. And if you are interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, you can sign up for a newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter. You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo. And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. So if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, Martin, what would be the best way to do that?
So on Drupal.org, various social platforms, you can find me at Mandclue.
Mike, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
I would say on Twitter, I am Mike Herschel. Herschel is spelled Herchel. And you can also email me at mike@herschel.com.
And Stephen, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Reach out to me on Twitter, Stephen Cross, Stephen with a PH.
If our listeners want to get in touch with me, you can find me at NixBand pretty much everywhere. And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Bye, everybody.